The legal letter arrived at 9:17 a.m. on a pristine Tuesday morning, shattering the quiet routine of my home office. Black text on crisp white paper demanded what the sender called equitable distribution of marital assets, but what I recognized as nothing short of extortion. In elegant legal language, my husband's mistress, a woman I'd never met, claimed entitlement to half of everything we'd built over 20 years of marriage. She didn't know that by sunset, I'd already set wheels in motion that would not only protect what was mine, but reveal the careful chess game I'd been playing for years. A game where I had always been several moves ahead. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The phone call came while I was reviewing quarterly earnings reports for our family's investment portfolio. My husband Nathan's voice sounded strange, distant, yet urgent. "Audrey, I need to talk to you. It's important. I'm coming home now." I noted the time, 10:42 a.m. on a Tuesday. In 18 years of marriage, Nathan had never left his financial consulting firm during business hours. Something was very wrong. Closed my laptop and moved to the kitchen of our Westlake home, the sprawling Tudor-style residence we'd purchased 7 years ago when our investments had first begun to truly flourish. As I waited, I brewed a pot of Earl Grey tea, not the calming ritual it usually was, but something to occupy my hands while my mind raced through possibilities. An hour later, Nathan's Audi pulled into our circular driveway. Through the kitchen window, I watched him sit motionless in the driver's seat for nearly 3 minutes before finally emerging. His normally impeccable appearance was disheveled, tie loosened, hair uncombed, the confident posture that had first attracted me to him at a charity gala 2 decades ago, now slumped with what looked like defeat. The front door opened, then closed with barely a sound. Nathan appeared in the kitchen doorway, holding a manila envelope identical to the one that had arrived for me earlier that morning. "We need to talk," he said, his voice hollow. I gestured to the steaming teapot. "Would you like some tea first?" He shook his head impatiently. "Audrey, this is serious." "I know," I replied, sliding my own copy of the legal letter across the granite countertop. "I received one too." His face drained of color as he stared at my letter, then back at his own. "You already know that Claudia Bennett believes she's entitled to half of our assets?" "Yes, I received her attorney's letter this morning." Nathan collapsed onto one of the bar stools, his body seeming to fold in on itself. "Audrey, I can explain." "I'm sure you can," I said, pouring myself a cup of tea with steady hands that surprised even me. "You've been having an affair with Ms. Bennett for 14 months. She works in your downtown office building, not at your firm, but at the marketing agency on the 12th floor. You've been meeting her at the Westbrook Hotel, always booking through your private email account but paying with our joint credit card." His head snapped up, eyes wide with shock. "How did you know?" "Nathan, did you really think I wouldn't notice?" I took a careful sip of tea, allowing the familiar warmth to center me. "What I don't know is why she believes she's entitled to our assets. Perhaps you could explain that part." The silence stretched between us, punctuated only by the soft ticking of the antique grandfather clock in our hallway, a wedding gift from my grandmother. Finally, Nathan spoke, his voice barely audible. "I told her things I shouldn't have. Obviously. She thinks I'm the financial genius behind everything we have." A bitter laugh escaped him. "She thinks I built everything." Now it was my turn to laugh, though there was no humor in it. The sound echoed harshly in our custom-designed kitchen, with its imported Italian marble and professional-grade appliances that Nathan had never learned to use. "And what exactly did you tell her about my role in all of this?" I asked. Nathan couldn't meet my eyes. "I may have implied that you were just supportive, that the business decisions were mine." The familiar sting of this particular lie, one I'd allowed him to tell at countless dinner parties and client meetings, felt different now. For years, I'd played along with Nathan's carefully constructed image as the financial wizard, the investment genius who had turned his wife's modest inheritance into an empire. I'd smiled politely when he'd introduced me as his beautiful wife, rather than his business partner, when he'd accepted compliments for investment strategies I'd developed, when he'd taken credit for our portfolio's consistent outperformance of the market. I'd always thought of it as a harmless vanity, a small price to pay for marital harmony. Now I realized I'd been feeding a delusion that had grown too large to contain. And now she wants her share of your financial brilliance, I said, the irony thick in my voice. Nathan ran his hands through his salt and pepper hair, the gesture of frustration so familiar it almost made my heart ache. Almost. It's worse than that, he admitted. I promised her things. A future. A life together. In our house? I asked, my voice deceptively calm. He flinched. She loves this house. I showed her pictures. Of course he had. This house had been my dream, my vision. Each room carefully designed, each detail personally selected. The thought of another woman coveting it, planning to replace me in it, sent a cold spike of anger through my chest. And now she wants half of everything, I said. Half of what you promised her. Nathan nodded miserably. Her lawyer says she can prove we had an agreement, that I promised to leave you, to share everything with her. Did you make that promise? Nathan? His silence was answer enough. I walked to the window, looking out at the immaculate gardens I'd planned and overseen. The Japanese maple I'd planted on our 10th anniversary just beginning to show its autumn colors. The irony, Nathan, is that there's nothing to take. He looked up, confusion creasing his brow. What are you talking about? We have the house, the vacation property in Sedona, the investment portfolio? No, I interrupted gently. I have those things, or rather, various legal entities that I control have those things. Nathan stared at me, comprehension slowly dawning on his face. What have you done, Audrey? I turned from the window to face my husband fully. Nothing you wouldn't have done if you'd been the financial expert you've pretended to be all these years. I walked to my office, Nathan following like a bewildered child. From my safe, the one whose combination he'd never bothered to ask for, I removed a thick portfolio of documents and laid them on my desk. Our prenuptial agreement, I began, pointing to the first document, which you signed without reading carefully because you were too eager to access my inheritance. The trust documents for the Westlake property, established in my grandmother's name. The LLC formation papers for our investment portfolio, listing me as the sole managing member. Nathan's face grew paler with each document I indicated. The Sedona property, owned by a family trust that predates our marriage. The art collection, technically on long-term loan from a foundation I established 12 years ago. But the consulting firm? Nathan stammered. My business? Operates in leased office space with most equipment financed through one of my holding companies. I replied calmly. Your name is on the door, certainly, but check your partnership agreement. Your equity is contingent on specific performance metrics and ethical behavior clauses. Nathan sank into my office chair, the weight of realization crushing him. Why would you do this? Didn't you trust me? The question hung in the air, its naivety almost touching. After a moment, I answered truthfully. I watched my mother lose everything when my father left her for his secretary. I saw how easily a husband could erase a wife's contributions when there was no paper trail. I vowed never to let that happen to me. I paused, allowing the irony of the situation to sink in. I never thought I'd need these protections against you specifically, Nathan, but I always knew I might need them against someone. So what happens now? He asked, his voice small. I gathered the documents, returning them to my safe with methodical precision. Now, I contacted my attorney, We respond to Ms. Bennett's demands with the reality of our financial situation. And then you and I have a very long conversation about whether there's anything left to salvage here. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. Nathan buried his face in his hands. I've made such a mess of everything. Looked at this man I'd loved for 20 years. This man who had been happy to take credit for my financial acumen, my business instincts, my careful planning, and who had now promised it all away to another woman. Yes, I agreed softly. You really have. As if on cue, my phone buzzed with a text message from Patricia, my attorney and oldest friend from college. Just reviewed the Bennett letter. Don't worry, your structures are solid. Meeting tomorrow at 9? I typed a quick confirmation, then turned. Back to Nathan, who was staring at the life we'd built together, a life he'd just realized he didn't control. Get some rest, I told him. Tomorrow's going to be a very long day. As Nathan trudged upstairs to the guest bedroom, I returned to the kitchen, poured a fresh cup of tea, and opened my laptop. The quarterly earnings report still needed my review, after all. Life and business continued, regardless of personal turmoil. The legal letter that had arrived at 9:17 a.m. lay on the counter, its threats now seeming almost laughable. Claudia Bennett thought she was claiming her rightful share of Nathan's financial empire. She was about to discover that the empire had never been his to promise. I smiled as I reviewed our portfolio's performance. Some lessons came at a very high price. Nathan and his mistress were about to learn exactly how expensive this particular education would be. Sleep eluded me that night. I lay awake in our master bedroom, the room that Claudia Bennett had apparently already mentally redecorated, listening to the occasional creaks from the guest room down the hall where Nathan tossed and turned. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 3 times before I finally gave up on rest and slipped into my home office. The soft glow of my desk lamp illuminated the space that had always been my sanctuary. Unlike Nathan's downtown office with its imposing mahogany desk and wall of business awards, many for achievements that were primarily mine, my workspace was designed for function and comfort. The ergonomic chair, the dual monitors, the hidden filing systems, everything arranged to facilitate the work that had built our wealth. I unlocked my primary filing cabinet and pulled out a thick accordion folder labeled Contingency Documentation. Inside was the paper trail I'd maintained for over 15 years, evidence of my role in our financial success that Nathan had never bothered to notice, email correspondences where investment strategies were clearly mine, financial models with my digital signatures embedded in the metadata, meeting notes where Nathan had scribbled reminders to ask A about this, next to complex financial concepts he didn't fully grasp, recordings of our strategy sessions that he'd insisted on keeping for reference, but had never actually reviewed. Sorted these materials methodically, creating a timeline that demonstrated my financial leadership throughout our marriage. By 5:30 a.m., I had organized everything for my meeting with Patricia. The soft ping of an incoming email drew my attention to my laptop. It was from Claudia Bennett herself, not her attorney. A breach of protocol that didn't surprise me. Audrey, you don't know me, but I believe we should talk woman to woman before this gets uglier than it needs to be. Nathan has explained everything to me about your arrangement. He says you've always understood that your marriage was more of a business partnership than a love match. I'm not trying to take anything you've actually earned, but Nathan has been the financial genius behind your wealth for years while you've enjoyed the benefits. All I want is what's fair based on his contributions. Perhaps we could meet for coffee and discuss this reasonably, without lawyers. Claudia stared at the email, a strange calm settling over me. So this was her strategy. Divide and conquer. Position herself as reasonable while painting me as the obstacle to an amicable resolution. And perpetuate the fiction that Nathan was the financial genius behind our success. There was a bitter humor in how completely she'd fallen for Nathan's self-aggrandizing narrative. I wondered if she'd bothered to research me at all before making her demands. Had she looked beyond the supportive wife facade to discover my double major in finance and economics from Wharton, my early career at Goldman Sachs, the investment algorithm I'd developed before I even met Nathan? Probably not. It was easier to believe what Nathan had told her, that he was the brilliant one, and I was just along for the ride. I didn't respond to her email. Instead, I forwarded it to Patricia with a brief note. Evidence of direct contact, contrary to legal protocol. Also, note the claims about Nathan's role. As dawn broke over our carefully landscaped property, I showered and dressed with particular care. A charcoal Armani suit, pearls that had been my grandmother's, and subtle makeup, armor for the battle ahead. Nathan was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, his eyes bloodshot, his expensive dress shirt wrinkled from a night spent in the guest room. "Did you sleep at all?" he asked, his voice rough. "Enough," I replied, pouring myself coffee. "I've been preparing for my meeting with Patricia." Nathan's hand trembled slightly as he held his own coffee mug. "Audrey, before you go, can we talk about this? There must be some way to resolve everything without it becoming a legal nightmare." I studied my husband's face, the face I'd woken. Up to for nearly 2 decades, the face that had once represented partnership and trust. Now, I see only desperation and self-interest. "Did you know she emailed me directly?" I asked. "Claudia. She wants to meet woman to woman to discuss what's fair based on your contributions." Nathan paled. "I didn't know she would contact you." "I swear. Did you tell her our marriage was more of a business partnership than a love match?" He looked away. "I might have said something like that. I was trying to, I don't know, justify things to her, to myself." "And did you explain to her exactly what your contributions have been to our financial success?" I pressed. Silence stretched between us. Answer enough. "That's what I thought," I said, gathering my purse and portfolio. "I'm meeting Patricia at 9. I suggest you use this time to consider exactly what assets you brought into this marriage and what you've truly contributed since then. It might help adjust your expectations about what you'll have after this is over." "What does that mean?" Nathan's voice held an edge of panic. "Are you talking about divorce now?" I paused at the kitchen doorway. "I'm talking about reality, Nathan. Something you've been avoiding for quite some time." Patricia's office occupied the top floor of a sleek downtown building, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering commanding views of the city skyline. As I sat in her private conference room spreading documents across the polished mahogany table, I could see Nathan's office building in the distance, and somewhere within it, the 12th floor marketing agency where Claudia Bennett worked. "Start from the beginning," Patricia said, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she examined the papers before her. "Tell me everything about this woman's claims." I took a deep breath. "Claudia Bennett has been having an affair with Nathan for 14 months. Based on her legal letter, she believes she's entitled to half of our assets because Nathan promised to leave me and share his fortune with her." Patricia nodded, making notes. "And Nathan has confirmed this promise?" "He hasn't denied it. But the larger issue is that she believes Nathan is the financial architect of our wealth. She's demanding her fair share of what she thinks he created." A slight smile played at Patricia's lips. "But we know better, don't we?" "We do," I confirmed, pulling out my organized timeline. "Here's comprehensive documentation of my role in every major financial decision, investment strategy, and business venture over the last 18 years. Patricia leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "You've always been thorough, Audrey. Ever since law school, I watched you document everything, protect yourself at every turn. I used to think you were being paranoid." I watched my mother lose everything in her divorce, I reminded her. My father's lawyer convinced the court that his business success was despite her, not because of her. I wasn't going to let that happen to me. And now your precautions will pay off, Patricia said, reviewing the trust documents and LLC formations I'd established years ago. These structures are solid. The prenuptial agreement is airtight. Ms. Bennett has no claim whatsoever on your protected assets. And Nathan? I asked quietly. Patricia removed her glasses, her gaze direct. That depends on what you want, Audrey. Legally, he has very little ground to stand on if you choose to end the marriage. The infidelity, the financial misrepresentations to a third party, the attempt to promise away assets that weren't his. All of this violates multiple clauses in your agreements. I stood up, walking to the window. The city sprawled below, a landscape of ambition and opportunity that had once represented so much possibility for Nathan and me. Now it felt like a battlefield. I haven't decided about the marriage yet, I admitted. But first, I need to neutralize Ms. Bennett's claims and make sure Nathan understands exactly where he stands. Then let's focus on that, Patricia said, returning to her legal pad. I'll draft a response to her attorney that outlines the actual ownership structures of your assets. We'll include just enough documentation to make it clear that her claims are baseless without revealing all your cards. And we should address her directly by contacting me, I added. I want it on record that she's attempting to circumvent proper legal channels. Patricia smiled, a predatory gleam in her eye. Oh, we'll definitely include that. By the time we're done, her attorney will be advising her to drop this entire matter as quickly and quietly as possible. As Patricia began drafting our response, my phone buzzed with a text from Nathan. Claudia's attorney just called me. They want a meeting. What should I do? I showed the message to Patricia, who raised an eyebrow. They're getting nervous already. Good. What is Nathan's legal position here? I asked. Technically, he's the injured party in their demands, not me. Technically, yes, Patricia agreed. But he's also implicated in making false promises about assets he doesn't control. His best legal strategy would be to align with you against her claims. I typed a response to Nathan. Tell them you'll need to consult with your attorney. Don't agree to any meeting without legal representation. His reply came quickly. What attorney? We've always used Patricia. Patricia read the message over my shoulder and laughed softly. He's just realizing that I'm your attorney, not his. The scales are falling from his eyes rather rapidly today. Recommend someone for him, I suggested. Someone competent but not overly aggressive. I don't want this turning into more of a circus than it already is. Patricia nodded, jotting down a name. Martin Geller. Good attorney, ethical, won't encourage Nathan to make this messier than necessary. I relayed the recommendation to Nathan, then turned back to the task at hand. By noon, we had drafted a comprehensive response to Claudia Bennett's demands, a document that systematically dismantled her claims while revealing just enough about the actual ownership structures to make her position untenable. This should do it, Patricia said, reviewing our work. We'll serve this to her attorney by end of day. I expect they'll need at least 48 hours to regroup if they don't withdraw their demands entirely. And if they persist? I asked. Patricia's smile was confident. Then we increased the pressure. We have plenty of ammunition in reserve. As I gathered my things to leave, Patricia placed a hand on my arm. Audrey, whatever you decide about your marriage, and that's entirely your choice, know that you're in an exceptionally strong position. You built something remarkable here, and you protected it well. I nodded, feeling an unexpected surge of emotion. I just never thought I'd need these protections against Nathan. We never do, Patricia said, softly. That's why we put them in place. Leaving her office, I stepped into the bright afternoon sunlight, my mind already moving to the next phase of my strategy. Claudia Bennett thought she was claiming her share of a financial empire that rightfully belonged to the man she loved. She was about to discover that the empire had never been his to give, and that she had grossly underestimated the woman she was trying to replace. I returned home to find Nathan's car gone and a hastily scribbled note on the kitchen counter. Meeting Martin Geller at 2 Sal. We'll be back later. At least he was taking my advice about legal representation. Whether that indicated a desire to work with me or against me remained to be seen. With the house to myself, I decided to use this quiet time strategically. I needed to understand exactly what Nathan had promised Claudia, not just financially, but in terms of their future together. Had they discussed children? Retirement plans? Was she envisioning herself hosting our annual holiday party, sleeping in our bed, swimming in our pool? I poured myself a glass of water and carried it to Nathan's home office, a room he rarely used, preferring to work downtown where he could maintain the illusion of being the primary decision-maker in our financial affairs. Unlike my meticulously organized workspace, Nathan's home office was largely for show, with business books he'd never read and financial journals still in their plastic wrappers. The computer on his desk was strictly for personal use: emails, social media, fantasy football leagues. He'd never bothered to password protect it, convinced that his personal life wasn't interesting enough to warrant security measures. Another mistake in judgment. I hesitated briefly before logging in. This wasn't how I'd imagined my marriage would evolve, me investigating my husband like he was an adversarial business entity. But then, he hadn't imagined I'd discover his affair through a legal demand letter, so perhaps we were both in uncharted territory. His emails loaded quickly, organized. With the haphazard system he'd always used, I didn't have to search long to find a folder labeled simply C. Inside were hundreds of messages exchanged with Claudia Bennett over the past 14 months, documenting the evolution of their relationship from professional acquaintances to lovers to conspirators. I scanned them chronologically, watching their relationship unfold through the digital record. Nathan, it was wonderful running into you in the elevator again. Thank you for the coffee recommendation. The new place on the corner is indeed exceptional. Perhaps we could grab a cup together sometime. Claudia dinner last night was incredible. Who knew financial analysis could be so fascinating? Or maybe it's just the analyst who's captivating. When can I see you again? See, I can't stop thinking about the weekend in Chicago. The way you talked about investment strategies over breakfast in bed made even that sound sexy. You're wasted in that partnership. You should be running your own firm. See, Nathan, I've been calculating again what we discussed. If what you say about your portfolio performance is accurate, and I know it is, you're brilliant at this, we could easily afford the house in Lake Forest and still have enough for the vacation property in Napa. I've attached some listings I found. Dream with me? 'Cause the more I think about it, the more certain I am. You've built this empire while she's just coasted along. Why should she get half when you did all the work? My cousin's husband is an attorney who specializes in these situations. He says there might be ways to protect what's rightfully yours before you make any moves. Should I set up a meeting? See, I felt a strange detachment as I read through their exchanges, watching Nathan construct an entirely fictional narrative about his financial acumen while Claudia eagerly embraced the role of the woman who truly appreciated his genius. It would have been almost comical if it weren't so personally devastating. The most recent emails revealed the escalation of their plans. Nathan, I'm tired of waiting. You've been saying just a few more months for almost a year now. I've already started looking at new jobs in anticipation of our life together. Either you're serious about us or you're not. I deserve better than being your secret. C. I've spoken with Jason, my cousin's husband, again. He says your concern about losing everything in a divorce is probably exaggerated, especially given your role as the primary wealth creator. Times have changed. Courts recognize the value of the spouse who builds the financial foundation. We have options. Let's meet with him. See, the meeting with Jason was enlightening, wasn't it? I told you she couldn't just take everything. The plan he outlined makes perfect sense. We document your contributions, file the appropriate motions, and ensure you retain what you've earned. You've been the financial genius behind everything. Why should you walk away with less than you deserve? See, I've instructed Jason to send the initial letter. It's time, Nathan. I'm ready to build our life together, in the house we deserve, with the future you've earned. Be brave, my love. By this time next month, we'll be planning our housewarming party. See, I closed the email window, feeling oddly calm. So this was how it had happened. Claudia pressuring Nathan, Nathan feeding her delusions about his financial contributions, both of them convincing themselves that I was somehow the obstacle to their happiness, rather than a person who'd invested 20 years in a marriage and partnership. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. Letter delivered to Bennett's attorney at 3:17 p.m. Receipt confirmed. Our first counter-move was now in play. I sent a quick acknowledgement, then continued my investigation. Beyond the emails, Nathan's computer contained other illuminating materials. Browser bookmarks for real estate listings in upscale neighborhoods, a spreadsheet attempting to catalog joint assets with wildly inaccurate valuations, and a clumsily drafted timeline of his supposed key financial decisions that had built our wealth. The timeline was particularly revealing. Nathan had reconstructed our financial history to minimize my contributions while inflating his own. Investments I'd researched and executed became his strategic vision. Property acquisitions I'd negotiated became his market timing genius. Even the inheritance from my grandmother that had formed our initial capital base was characterized as funds he had wisely allocated and grown. I saved copies of everything to a secure cloud drive, then carefully restored Nathan's computer to exactly how I'd found it. These materials wouldn't necessarily be needed legally. Patricia already had the documentation that mattered, but they provided valuable insight into Nathan and Claudia's mindset and expectations. As I closed the office door behind me, my phone rang, an unknown number. I answered cautiously. Mrs. Reynolds? This is Martin Geller. I'm with your husband, and he's asked me to reach out to you directly. Mr. Geller, I replied, keeping my tone professional. I understand you're representing Nathan in this matter. Well, that's actually why I'm calling, the attorney said, his voice measured. After reviewing the situation, I've advised Nathan that his interests would be best served by aligning with your position against Ms. Bennett's claims, rather than pursuing any adversarial approach regarding your marital assets. I allowed myself a small smile. That seems sensible. Nathan has authorized me to communicate that he's prepared to fully cooperate with your legal team to address Ms. Bennett's demands. He's also authorized me to inform you that he's willing to abide by whatever terms you deem appropriate regarding your marriage going forward. Translation. Nathan had realized he had no legal leverage and was now trying to minimize the damage. Appreciate Mr. Geller's professionalism, I said. Please tell Nathan I'll be home this evening, and we can discuss next steps then. After ending the call, I texted Patricia. Nathan's attorney called. He's backing down and wants to align against Bennett. Exactly as you predicted. Her response came quickly. They've realized their position. Smart move on their part, though too late to avoid consequences. Expect contact from Bennett's side within 24 hours. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 4 times as I made my way to the kitchen. I needed to prepare for Nathan's return and our inevitable conversation. This wouldn't be a discussion about saving our marriage, too much had been revealed for that, but about how we would proceed with dismantling it. I was setting the kettle on the stove when my laptop chimed with an email notification. Claudia Bennett again, this time with a very different tone. Audrey, my attorney has just shared some concerning information with me about the ownership structures of what I had believed were Nathan's assets. Clearly, there has been a misunderstanding about the financial arrangements in your marriage. I want to clarify that I have no interest in claiming anything that rightfully belongs to you. My only concern has been ensuring that Nathan's contributions are fairly recognized. Perhaps we should indeed meet to discuss this situation directly. I believe there may be facts that Nathan has misrepresented to both of us. Claudia, the email radiated, panic barely concealed beneath a veneer of reasonableness. Our response letter had achieved exactly the effect Patricia had intended, creating doubt about Nathan's claims and destabilizing Claudia's confidence in her position. Now she was attempting to pivot, positioning herself as potentially another victim of Nathan's misrepresentations rather than an aggressor. It was a predictable but clumsy strategy shift. I forwarded the email to Patricia with a brief note. Second direct contact attempt. She's retreating but still trying to establish direct communication. Thoughts? Patricia's response was immediate. Do not engage. Forward any communications but do not respond. We maintain pressure through formal channels only. As I closed my laptop, I heard Nathan's car pulling into the driveway. The sound was once familiar and welcome. My partner returning. Home after a day's work. Now it signaled the beginning of a difficult conversation that would determine how we dismantled 2 decades of shared life. I poured hot water over a tea bag, watching the color slowly infuse the clear liquid. Like this tea, the truth was finally diffusing through the clear water of lies Nathan had been stepping in. And like tea, once the truth had colored the water, there was no way to separate them again. The front door opened and closed quietly. Nathan's footsteps in the hallway were hesitant, lacking their usual confidence. When he appeared in the kitchen doorway, he looked diminished somehow. The carefully constructed persona of the successful financial consultant stripped away to reveal the man beneath. "Audrey," he said, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. "We need to talk about what happens now." I gestured to the seat across from me. "Yes, we do. I've heard from your attorney and from Claudia. It seems everyone's reconsidering their positions." Nathan sat heavily, dropping his expensive briefcase carelessly to the floor. "I've made a terrible mistake. Several, actually." "Yes," I agreed calmly. "You have." The next phase of my strategy was about to begin, not to save our marriage, which was beyond repair, but to ensure that the end of it happened on my terms. Nathan and Claudia had constructed an elaborate fantasy about wealth and entitlement. Now it was time for them to face the reality of what happens when that fantasy collides with carefully documented truth. "How bad is it?" Nathan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I studied with my husband across the kitchen table. The confident man who had left our home that morning had been replaced by someone who looked physically smaller, as if the truth had compressed him somehow. "Legally, Claudia has no claim whatsoever on any significant assets," I replied calmly. Patricia's response to her attorney made that abundantly clear. "The ownership structures I established years ago are ironclad." Nathan winced. "And us? How bad is it for us?" The question hung in the air between us. 20 years of shared history distilled into 5 simple words. "That depends on what you mean by us," I said. "Our marriage? I think we both know the answer to that. Your personal financial position? That's considerably more complicated." I rose and retrieved a folder from my office, then slid it across the table to him. "This is a preliminary assessment of assets that are legally yours versus those that are mine or held in trusts and LLCs that I control." Nathan opened the folder slowly, as if afraid of what he might find inside. His eyes widened as he reviewed the document on top, a clean, concise spreadsheet detailing our actual financial positions. "This can't be right," he murmured, flipping through the pages with increasing agitation. The Westlake house, the Sedona property, the investment portfolio, the art collection. He looked up, his face pale. "According to this, I personally own almost nothing of significant value. You own your clothes, your personal effects, your car, though that's leased through the firm, and approximately 12% of the consulting business, contingent on the ethics clauses in your partnership agreement." I kept my voice matter of fact. free of the anger that still simmered beneath my composed exterior. You also have your personal retirement account and the checking account in your name, which currently contains about $37,000. Nathan ran his hand through his hair, a gesture of distress I'd seen countless times during our marriage, usually when an investment wasn't performing as expected or a business contact failed to be impressed by his supposed financial acumen. But, "We've been married for 20 years, he protested. "Everything we've built has been together." "Has it?" I asked quietly. "Tell me, Nathan, what exactly was your contribution to the Westlake property acquisition? Do you even remember how we financed it?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again, uncertainty clouding his expression. "It was purchased through the Eleanor Grant Family Trust, named after my grandmother, using the proceeds from the riverfront development project that I structured in 2012. You were in Aspen on a ski trip with clients when we closed." I kept my voice level, reciting facts rather than accusations. "You presented the house as a gift to me on our 13th anniversary, though in reality, I had handled every aspect of the purchase." His face flushed. "I remember it differently." "I'm sure you do," I replied. "Just as you've remembered differently about who developed our investment strategy, who identified the commercial properties that formed the backbone of our portfolio, who structured the tax-advantaged acquisitions that preserved our capital. You've spent years convincing yourself that these were your achievements, Nathan. You've built your identity on it." "And you let me," he shot back, a flash of anger momentarily replacing his shock. "You never corrected me, never challenged me when I took credit. You played along with the charade." I nodded, acknowledging this truth. "I did. That was my mistake." "Why?" he asked, genuine bewilderment in his voice. "If you were so brilliant, so capable, why live in my shadow? Why let me take the credit?" It was a fair question, one I'd asked myself repeatedly over the years. The answer had evolved over time, but I owed him the truth now. "At first, it was because I loved you, and your pride seemed harmless," I said softly. "You needed to be the successful one, the provider, the financial genius. I told myself it didn't matter who got the credit as long as we were building something together." I paused, gathering my thoughts. Later, I realized there were advantages to being underestimated. By you, by your colleagues, by the financial world at large. People reveal more, negotiate less aggressively, when they don't perceive you as a threat. Nathan looked down at the spreadsheet again, reality slowly sinking in. "And all this time you were protecting yourself." "Yes," I admitted. "After watching my mother lose everything in her divorce, I vowed never to be financially vulnerable. The separate entities, the trust structures, the careful documentation. It became second nature." "Did you ever trust me at all?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. The question pierced through my carefully maintained composure. Had I trusted him? There had been a time, early in our marriage, when I'd believed in our partnership completely. But that trust had eroded so gradually I hadn't noticed its disappearance until now. "I trusted your love," I finally answered. "I never trusted your financial judgment, and now, it seems I was right on both counts." Nathan flinched as if I'd slapped him. Before he could respond, my phone buzzed with a text message from Patricia. "Bennett's attorney requesting an urgent call. Says client wishes to withdraw all claims immediately." I showed the message to Nathan, whose complexion paled further. "That was fast," he muttered. "Patricia is very good at what she does," I replied. And Claudia's position was untenable from the start. "What happens now?" Nathan asked, echoing his earlier question, but this time with resignation rather than panic. "Now, we formalize the end of Claudia's claims, and then we discuss the end of our marriage." The words hung heavy in the kitchen that had witnessed countless dinner parties, holiday gatherings, and quiet moments throughout our years together. Speaking them aloud made them real in a way that all my preparations hadn't. I never meant to. "Hurt you," Nathan said quietly. But you did, I replied. Not just with the affair, but with the lies you told about me. To Claudia, to yourself, to everyone who would listen. You erased my contributions, Nathan. You made me invisible in my own success story. He had no answer for that. After a moment, he asked, Will you take everything? Leave me with nothing? The question revealed how little he really knew me, even after 20 years. I'm not vindictive, Nathan. I won't destroy you financially, despite what you've done. I pulled another document from the folder. This is a preliminary settlement proposal. You'll retain your stake in the consulting firm, your personal accounts, and I'll transfer ownership of the downtown condo to you. It's more than fair, given the circumstances. He scanned the document, surprised by its generosity. Why would you do this? Because unlike you, I actually meant my wedding vows, I said simply. And because I don't need to destroy you to prove my worth. As if on cue, my phone rang, Patricia calling to discuss Claudia's retreat. I excused myself to take the call. In my office. Audrey, you won't believe how quickly they've folded, Patricia said, not bothering with pleasantries. Bennett's attorney practically begged me to accept a complete withdrawal of all claims. Apparently, our response letter triggered some serious discussions between them. Did they offer any explanation? I asked, curious about the sudden capitulation. Not explicitly, but reading between the lines, it seems Ms. Bennett finally looked into your background and realized she'd been fed a completely fictional account of your financial role. Her attorney mentioned something about material misrepresentations by a third party that had led to their regrettable misunderstanding of the situation. I smiled despite myself. In other words, she finally Googled me and discovered I wasn't just a decorative spouse. Precisely, Patricia confirmed. I suspect. She also realized that pursuing this could damage her professionally. A marketing executive attempting to extort assets based on an affair isn't exactly a career-enhancing move. What are they offering? I asked. Full withdrawal of all claims, a signed confidentiality agreement, and a formal apology. Though that last part would be private, not filed with the court. I considered this for a moment. Accept the withdrawal and confidentiality agreement. Skip the apology. I don't need her contrition. And Nathan? Patricia asked cautiously. Have you decided how to proceed? We're discussing settlement terms now, I replied. I'll send you the draft agreement once we've reached preliminary terms. After ending the call, I remained in my office for a few moments, collecting my thoughts. In just 48 hours, the carefully constructed fiction of my marriage had completely unraveled. Yet instead of feeling devastated, I felt strangely liberated. For years, I'd been living a double life. The brilliant financial strategist who built wealth through careful analysis and calculated risk, and the supportive wife who allowed her husband to claim credit for her achievements. Now those two identities were finally merging into one authentic self. When I returned to the kitchen, Nathan was still reviewing the settlement proposal, making occasional notes in the margins. Claudia is withdrawing all claims, I informed him. Her attorney contacted Patricia to arrange the formal withdrawal and a confidentiality agreement. Nathan nodded without looking up. That's something at least. Did you love her? I asked suddenly, the question escaping before I could consider its wisdom. Nathan finally met my gaze, surprise evident in his expression. I thought I did, he admitted. But now I'm not sure what was real and what was performance. She wanted to be a successful financial genius, so that's who I was with her. Just like I've been playing that role with everyone else. His honesty was unexpected and strangely painful. For the first time, I glimpsed the insecurity that had driven him all these years, the desperate need to be admired, to be seen as exceptional. Who are you when you're not performing, Nathan? I asked softly. He stared at the settlement papers, then out the window at the carefully landscaped garden I had designed. I don't know anymore, he finally whispered. Maybe I never did. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 7 times, marking the passage of another hour in this day of revelations. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across our immaculate lawn. "I'll be staying at the downtown condo tonight," Nathan said eventually, his voice steadier. "I think we both need some space to process everything." I nodded, relieved and saddened simultaneously. "That seems wise," as he gathered his things to leave. He paused in the doorway. "For what it's worth, Audrey, I am sorry. Not just for the affair, but for everything. For diminishing you, for taking credit, for not appreciating who you really are." "I know," I replied. And I did. Nathan wasn't a villain in this story, just a deeply flawed man who had made a series of increasingly destructive choices. We'll talk tomorrow about next steps. After he left, I poured myself a glass of wine and carried it out to the garden terrace. The evening air was cool against my skin as I contemplated the strange turn my life had taken. By tomorrow, the legal battle with Claudia Bennett will be formally over. The process of untangling my marriage would begin. But tonight, sitting alone, in the gathering darkness, I allowed myself to feel the full spectrum of emotions I'd been holding at bay. The betrayal, the anger, the grief, and beneath it all, a surprising sense of possibility. For 20 years, I'd been the power behind the throne. Now, for the first time, I would step into the light and claim my achievements openly. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. My phone buzzed with an incoming email, the formal confirmation from Patricia that Claudia's attorney had filed the withdrawal of all claims. Attached was a copy of the document, ending this chapter of the drama decisively. I smiled as I read it. Claudia Bennett had thought she was claiming her share of a financial empire built by the man she loved. Instead, she had inadvertently freed me from the constraints of my own making. Sometimes I reflected. Our greatest challenges arrive disguised as catastrophes, and sometimes it takes a complete unraveling for us to discover who we truly are. The morning after Nathan's revelation about Claudia's true motives, I found myself in Patricia's office again, this time with Martin Geller joining us via video conference. The three of us were reviewing the evidence Nathan had uncovered and discussing its implications for our various legal proceedings. "These emails constitute clear evidence of fraud and potential criminal conspiracy," Martin said, his expression grave on the screen. "Nathan is well within his rights to pursue criminal charges against both Claudia Bennett and this Marcus Winters. Character." Patricia nodded in agreement. "The premeditated nature of their scheme is particularly damning. This wasn't an affair that evolved into opportunistic financial demands. This was a calculated con from the beginning." I studied the printed emails spread across Patricia's desk, still processing the bizarre turn this situation had taken. "What's the likelihood they've done this successfully before?" I asked. "Very high," Martin replied. "There are references in the later emails to the Chicago approach and the Seattle payoff that suggest established patterns and previous victims." "Do we have enough to identify these other targets?" Patricia asked. Martin shook his head. "Not specifically from these emails. We'd need access to their full communications, which would require law enforcement involvement." I considered this for a moment. "And what's Nathan leaning toward? Does he want to pursue criminal charges?" "He's conflicted," Martin admitted. "On one hand, he wants justice and to prevent them from targeting others. On the other, he's deeply embarrassed about how thoroughly he was manipulated and concerned about the professional ramifications if this becomes public." I could understand Nathan's hesitation. The revelation that he had been systematically targeted and deceived by a con artist might generate sympathy, but it would also expose how easily his ego had been exploited. Not a good look for a financial professional whose judgment clients relied upon. "What about a third option?" I suggested. "Something that neutralizes Claudia and Marcus without requiring a public proceeding?" Patricia raised an eyebrow. "What did you have in mind?" A private settlement with stringent terms, I explained. They sign comprehensive NDAs, agree to cease all similar activities, and provide details about previous victims that could be anonymously forwarded to relevant authorities. In exchange, we don't pursue criminal charges or public exposure. Essentially blackmail the blackmailers, Patricia observed with a slight smile. I prefer to think of it as negotiating from a position of strength, I replied. Something I've had considerable practice with over the years. Martin looked thoughtful. It could work, especially if they believe their alternative is criminal prosecution. The evidence is compelling enough that they'd likely take a deal. What would Nathan want in return, beyond their silence and cessation of activities? Patricia asked practically. Restitution would be appropriate, I suggested. Not for the emotional manipulation, there's no price for that, but for any actual expenses incurred during their relationship. Gifts, travel, meals at expensive restaurants. Martin nodded. I'll discuss it with him. He might find this approach more palatable than either outright prosecution or simply letting them walk away. As the meeting concluded, Patricia held me back for a private conversation. Audrey, are you sure you want to be this involved in resolving Nathan's situation with Claudia? You'd be well within your rights to wash your hands of the entire mess. I appreciated her concern. I know, but there's something satisfying about helping dismantle their scheme. Besides, I spent 20 years cleaning up Nathan's messes. Might as well make this the final one. Patricia studied me with a slight frown. Just be careful not to get pulled back into old patterns. You're finally free to focus on your own life and interests. Her words struck a chord. For 2 decades, I'd subordinated my identity to Nathan's, allowing him to take credit for my work, managing the behind-the-scenes details of our financial life while he played the role of successful provider. Even now, I was automatically stepping in to help resolve his problems. You're right, I acknowledged. I'll share my thoughts on the approach, but Nathan and Martin should handle the actual negotiations with Claudia and Marcus. I have my own future to focus on. And I did have a future to consider, one that suddenly seemed wide open with possibilities. For years, I'd operated in the shadows, making investment decisions and building wealth that was attributed to my husband. Now I had the opportunity to step into the light and claim my achievements. Later that afternoon, I found myself sitting in the sunroom of our Westlake home, my home now, contemplating what that future might look like. The space had always been my favorite, with its wall of windows overlooking the garden and the comfortable reading chair where I'd spent countless hours reviewing financial reports and researching investment opportunities. My phone buzzed with a text from Nathan, meeting with Claudia tomorrow. Martin thinks your approach is best. Thank you for the suggestion. I sent back a simple acknowledgement, then set the phone aside. This chapter of my life was closing, and I needed to start writing the next one. The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. When I opened it, I found my younger sister Elise standing on the porch, looking concerned. I came as soon as I could get away from the conference, she said, enveloping me in a hug. You sounded so calm on the phone that I knew something was seriously wrong. I laughed, despite myself. Only you would interpret calmness as a crisis. Signal. For most people, sure, normal emotion. For you? Definite sign of repressed trauma. She followed me into the kitchen, dropping her travel bag by the door. So, tell me everything. You said Nathan had an affair and his mistress tried to claim your assets? I poured us both glasses of wine and led her to the sunroom. It's a bit more complicated than that, actually. Over the next hour, I detailed the events of the past few days, the demand letter, the revelations about our asset structures, and finally the discovery that Claudia had been running a calculated con from the beginning. Elise's expressions shifted from outrage to satisfaction to astonishment as the story unfolded. Wait. So this woman specifically targeted Nathan as a wealthy financial expert, not knowing that you were the actual financial genius? That's Weirdly poetic justice. It is rather ironic, I agreed. She chose him precisely because he projected this image of financial success, never realizing it was largely built on taking credit for my work. And now he's refusing most of the settlement assets you offered? Elise shook her head in disbelief. That doesn't sound like the Nathan I know. I think he's genuinely having an identity crisis, I explained. Finding out he was being conned by Claudia forced him to confront how much of his own life has been a performance. Elise sipped her wine thoughtfully. So what happens now? With you, I mean. Not with Nathan and his con artist girlfriend. It was the question I'd been asking myself all day. I'm not entirely sure, I admitted. For 20 years I've been living a kind of double life, the brilliant financial strategist behind the scenes and the supportive wife in public. Now I have the chance to integrate those parts of myself. You could start your own investment firm, Elise suggested. God knows you have the track record to attract serious clients. The idea had crossed my mind. My investment strategy had consistently outperformed the market for years, and I had developed a network of financial contacts who respected my insights, even if they'd often assumed those insights were filtered through Nathan. Or you could do something completely different, Elise continued. Travel the world, start a nonprofit, write a book about financial independence for women. You've built enough wealth to do whatever you want. She was right, of course. The financial structures I'd created over the years hadn't just protected my assets from Nathan's mistress. They'd secured my complete independence. I could choose any path forward without financial constraints. I think I need some time to figure it out, I said finally. I've spent so long focusing on wealth creation and protection that I never really thought about what I'd do once I achieved complete financial security. Elise nodded, understanding in her eyes. That makes sense, but whatever you decide, promise. Me one thing? What's that? No more hiding your light. No more letting someone else take credit for your brilliance. She took my hand, her expression suddenly serious. I've watched you dim yourself for years to make Nathan shine brighter. Never again, okay? Her words brought unexpected tears to my eyes. I hadn't realized how much it had cost me emotionally to maintain the fiction of Nathan's financial genius, how much of my authentic self I'd suppressed to preserve his ego and our marriage. I promise, I said, squeezing her hand. No more hiding. The next morning, as Elise slept in the guest room, I was already at my desk reviewing a proposal from Patricia. She had suggested setting up a family office structure to manage my various investments and business interests going forward, a professional framework that would give me more flexibility and control as I determined my next steps. As I made notes, on the proposal, my phone buzzed with a text from Nathan. Meeting with Claudia and Marcus in an hour. Martin says we have everything we need. I wished him luck, then turned back to my work. Whatever happened in that meeting was Nathan's concern now, not mine. I had my own future to plan. Around noon, Elise joined me in the kitchen where I was preparing lunch. Any news from the Nathan versus con artists showdown? She asked, pouring herself coffee. Nothing yet, I replied, slicing vegetables for a salad. But I'm not expecting a play-by-play. Are you curious about how it will go? Elise wondered. I considered the question. Less than you might expect. I'm more focused on finalizing the divorce terms and moving forward. Elise studied me over her coffee mug. You really are done with him, aren't you? Not just angry or hurt, but genuinely finished. I am, I confirmed, surprising myself with how definitively I felt it. The trust is completely gone, not just because of the affair, but because of the years of taking credit for my work, of building his identity on achievements that weren't his. There's no coming back from that. Good, Elise said firmly. You deserve someone who celebrates your brilliance rather than appropriating it. Or perhaps I don't need anyone at all, I suggested. At least not right now. I think it's time. I focused on myself for a change. My phone rang, Martin Geller calling, unexpectedly. I excused myself to take the call in my office. "Audrey, I hope I'm not interrupting," Martin began, his voice strained. "Not at all. How did the meeting go?" "That's why I'm calling. Things took an unexpected turn. Claudia and Marcus arrived prepared to negotiate, but when confronted with the evidence, they didn't react as we anticipated." I frowned. "What happened?" "They tried to flee. Literally. Marcus apparently has outstanding warrants in 3 states, and when he realized how much evidence we had, he panicked and tried to run from the conference room. Security stopped him, and now..." "And now?" Martin sighed. "And now the police are involved. Nathan didn't have a choice. Once security detained Marcus, they found additional evidence of other schemes on his phone. It's becoming a much larger case than we expected." I absorbed this information, thinking of the implications. "Is Nathan all right?" "Shaken, but handling it well. He wanted me to let you know what happened and to thank you again for your help in exposing their scheme." Martin paused. "This will likely become public now, at least to some degree. The authorities believe Claudia and Marcus have targeted at least 7 other individuals with similar cons." After ending the call, I relayed the development to Elise, who let out a low whistle. "So much for your neat and tidy private resolution," she remarked. "Indeed," I agreed. "Though in the long run this might be better. If they've victimized others, they should face consequences." As the afternoon progressed, more details emerged through texts from Nathan. The police had found evidence linking Claudia and Marcus to a series of confidence schemes targeting wealthy individuals, primarily in the financial sector. What had started as a private confrontation had evolved into a multi-state fraud investigation. By evening, I had received a formal communication from Patricia confirming that the revised divorce agreement was ready for my review, with Nathan maintaining his position of claiming only his personal accounts and consulting firm stake. The legal end of my marriage was now just a matter of signatures and court filings. Sitting in the garden as the sun set, I felt an unexpected sense of closure. The crisis that had begun with Claudia Bennett's outrageous demands had catalyzed the end of my marriage, but it had also liberated me from a role I'd outgrown years ago. For the first time in decades, I was free to determine my own path forward, to claim my achievements publicly, to pursue new challenges, to be recognized for my own financial acumen rather than supporting someone else's facade. The woman who had received that legal letter just days ago would hardly recognize the person I was becoming, someone stepping confidently into her power, reclaiming her narrative, and preparing to write an entirely new chapter of her life. And for that unexpected gift of liberation, I supposed I owed Claudia Bennett a strange sort of thanks. "Mrs. Reynolds?" "There's Diane Campbell from the Wall Street Journal online too. She's asking for a comment about the Bennett Winters fraud case." My assistant's voice over the intercom pulled me from the quarterly investment report I'd been reviewing. It had been 3 weeks since Claudia and Marcus's attempted escape from their meeting with Nathan, and the story had grown from a private drama into a public sensation as more victims came forward and the scale of their cooperation became clear. "Tell her I have no comment at this time," I replied, "and please hold all calls for the next hour while I finish this analysis." "Of course, Mrs. Reynolds." The formality still felt strange. For years, I'd been Audrey to everyone at Nathan's. Firm, the boss's wife who occasionally joined client dinners, but otherwise remained in the background. Now, as the newly appointed head of Reynolds Capital Management, the family office I'd established to manage my investments, I was Mrs. Reynolds, the financial strategist whose investment approach had consistently outperformed the market for over a decade. My phone buzzed with a text from Elise. "Have you seen today's business section? You're practically famous now." I smiled, opening the digital edition of the Financial Times on my tablet. Sure enough, there was a feature article about the Reynolds method, the investment strategy I'd developed and refined over the years. now being recognized as one of the most successful approaches in private wealth management. The publicity was an unexpected side effect of the fraud investigation. As authorities had dug into Claudia and Marcus's scheme, they'd uncovered documentation of how thoroughly they had researched potential victims. Their files on Nathan had included detailed analysis of the Reynolds portfolio performance, with notes speculating about who was really making the investment decisions. Those notes had found their way to financial journalists, who began investigating the unusual success of the investments attributed to Nathan Reynolds. It hadn't taken long for them to discover that the true architect of that success had been his wife all along. The revelation had created a minor sensation in financial circles, partly because of the connection to the fraud case, but more significantly, because my consistent returns had outpaced many established investment managers. Suddenly, financial publications were clamoring for interviews about my methodology, and wealth management firms were reaching out with partnership offers. My desk phone rang again, the private line that bypassed my assistant. It was Patricia. "Have you made a decision about the Princeton Group's offer?" she asked without preamble. "Not yet," I admitted. "It's generous, but I'm not sure if joining an established firm is the right move for me right now." Princeton, one of the most prestigious wealth management companies in the country, had approached me about heading their private client investment division, a position that would put me in charge of billions in assets and a team of 30 analysts. "They've increased the offer," Patricia informed me. "Substantially. I just received the updated terms." "Email them over," I said. "But honestly, it's not about the money. It's about deciding what I actually want this next chapter to look like." After we hung up, I turned my chair to face the windows of my new office, a sleek space in a downtown building, deliberately located in a different part of the city from Nathan's firm. The view wasn't as expansive as the one from Patricia's office, but it was mine, representing a professional identity I was still in the process of defining. My assistant knocked gently before entering with a coffee. "The divorce papers arrived via courier," she said, placing a large envelope on my desk along with the steaming mug. "Mr. Geller said they need your signature by Friday." "Thank you, Helen." Alone again, I opened the envelope and spread the final divorce agreement across my desk. True to his word, Nathan had maintained his position in the asset division, claiming only his personal accounts, his stake in the consulting firm, and his personal possessions. He had even declined the downtown condo I'd offered, suggesting it be sold and the proceeds donated to a financial literacy program for women. The gesture had surprised me with its apparent sincerity. According to Martin Geller, Nathan was genuinely committed to rebuilding his life on a foundation of truth rather than borrowed achievements, starting with a clear-eyed assessment of his actual financial position. I signed the documents methodically, each signature marking another step in the formal conclusion of my 20-year marriage. The process should have felt momentous, but instead, it seemed like a simple administrative task, the paperwork catching up to an emotional reality that had already solidified. As I was placing the signed papers back in their envelope, my phone buzzed with another text, this time from Nathan himself. "Just saw the Financial Times piece. Congratulations." They finally got it right. I stared at the message, unsure how to respond. It was the first direct contact we'd had in weeks, our communications having been conducted entirely through our respective attorneys as the divorce and fraud case proceeded. After a moment's consideration, I typed back, "Thank you. How are you holding up with the media attention?" His response came quickly. "Better than expected. Turns out having your ego completely demolished is oddly liberating." "And you? Adjusting to—" "Being visible," I replied truthfully. "It's different after so many years behind the scenes." "You deserve the recognition," he wrote. "Always did." The conversation felt surreal. Polite exchanges between two people who had shared a life but now occupied entirely different realities. There was no animosity in his messages, just a strange blend of resignation and what seemed like genuine goodwill. Good luck with everything, Nathan, I finally wrote, not knowing what else to say. You too, Audrey. You're going to be brilliant. I set the phone down, feeling an unexpected wave of emotion. Not regret or longing, but a complex blend of closure and cautious optimism. The life I had shared with Nathan was over. Had been over long before Claudia. Bennett's demand letter arrived, but something new was taking shape in its place. The intercom buzzed again. Mrs. Reynolds, your 3 o'clock appointment is here. Victoria Chen from Stanford Business School. Send her in, please. Victoria Chen, a distinguished professor of finance with whom I'd corresponded for years, though always through Nathan's email account, had reached out after the media revelations about my investment strategy. She was interested in documenting my approach for a case study and possible inclusion in Stanford's curriculum. Mrs. Reynolds, she greeted me warmly as she entered. It's a pleasure to finally meet you in person after all these years of fascinating exchanges. I smiled, gesturing for her to take a seat. Please call me Audrey, and the pleasure is mine. Though I should apologize for the email deception, those messages came from me, not Nathan. Victoria laughed. I had my suspicions, especially given the technical depth of your analyses. Nathan was always charming at industry events, but he tended to gloss over the mathematical models in favor of broader market narratives. He played to his strengths, I acknowledged diplomatically. Well, I'm thrilled to finally be working directly with the actual architect of the Reynolds method, Victoria said, removing a recorder and notebook from her bag. This case study has the potential to influence a generation of financial analysts. For the next 2 hours, we delved into the details of my investment approach, the quantitative models I'd developed, the contrarian indicators I'd identified, the risk management strategies I'd implemented. Victoria asked probing questions that pushed me to articulate concepts I'd intuitively understood but never formally explained. This is fascinating, she said as our meeting concluded. The way you've integrated behavioral economics with traditional valuation metrics is truly innovative. Would you be open to guest lecturing for my advanced seminar next semester? My students would benefit tremendously from hearing directly from you. The invitation caught me off guard. Teaching isn't something I've considered before, I admitted. Just think about it, Victoria suggested. You have a gift for explaining complex concepts clearly, and your practical experience would be invaluable to students preparing for careers in finance. After she left, I found myself genuinely considering the possibility. Teaching had never been part of the future I'd envisioned, but then again, neither had running my own investment firm or being profiled in financial publications. The landscape of possibilities had expanded dramatically since I'd stepped out of Nathan's shadow. My phone pinged with an email notification, another journalist requesting an interview, this time for a feature on women in finance. I added it to the growing list of media inquiries I needed to address. The public attention was still uncomfortable, but I was gradually adjusting to it. Patricia had helped me engage a PR consultant who was guiding me through the process of establishing my public identity as a financial expert, something I'd never needed to consider when operating behind the scenes of Nathan's career. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across my office, I reviewed my schedule for the coming week, meetings with potential clients, a consultation with my new legal team about the structure of Reynolds Capital Management, coffee with a women's business alliance that had invited me to join their board, and dinner with Elise, who was flying in for the weekend. The rhythm of my days had transformed completely in just a few short weeks. Where I had once balanced my investment work with the social obligations of being Nathan's wife, I now moved through a landscape of my own creation, professional commitments I had chosen, relationships based on my expertise rather than my marital status. The transition hadn't been seamless. There were moments of uncertainty, instances where I found myself automatically deferring to others or downplaying my accomplishments, old habits from years of supporting Nathan's ego. But each day brought new opportunities to redefine myself, to step fully into the identity I had only partially inhabited before. My assistant knocked again. "Mrs. Reynolds, Patricia Blake is here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment but says it's important." "Send her in," I replied, curious about this unexpected visit. Patricia entered, impeccably dressed as always but with an unusual energy about her. "Have you seen this?" she asked without preamble, placing a tablet on my desk. I looked down at the screen, which displayed an article from a major business publication. The headline read, "Financial Fraud Case Exposes Hidden Gender. Bias in Wealth Management, Page 3, Patricia directed, a hint of satisfaction in her voice. I scrolled to the indicated section and began reading. The Reynolds case has sparked uncomfortable conversations within the financial industry about the persistent tendency to attribute financial success to men, even when evidence suggests women are the driving force. Investment firms are now examining their own unconscious biases in client relationships and hiring practices. What's remarkable about this situation is not just that Audrey Reynolds was the actual financial strategist behind the portfolio's success, says Victoria Chen, professor of finance at Stanford Business School, but that so many industry professionals accepted Nathan Reynolds' claims without question, despite performance metrics that significantly outpaced his educational background and track record. Multiple sources within the financial community have confirmed that the so-called Reynolds method had been quietly studied and admired for years, with its innovations attributed entirely to Nathan Reynolds despite his limited quantitative background. It speaks to a broader pattern, Chen continues. Women's contributions in finance are often overlooked, minimized, or attributed to male colleagues. The Reynolds revelation is forcing many of us to question our assumptions about who is really driving financial success in other partnerships as well. I looked up at Patricia, who was watching me with a slight smile. They're calling it the Reynolds effect now, the phenomenon of women's financial achievements being attributed to their male partners or colleagues. That's not what I expected to come from all this, I admitted. Patricia took a seat across from me. The article goes on to cite 3 other high-profile cases where successful investment strategies were later revealed to have been developed by women operating behind the scenes. Apparently, your story has encouraged others to come forward and claim credit for their work. There was a certain poetic justice to it. What had begun as a personal crisis, Nathan's affair and his mistress's demands, had evolved into something with much broader implications. The very structures that had allowed Nathan to claim credit for my financial acumen were now being examined and questioned throughout the industry. How do you feel about becoming a reluctant symbol for gender bias in finance? Patricia asked, studying me carefully. I considered the question. Conflicted, I finally answered. I never set out to make a statement about gender dynamics. I made choices, some good, some less so, based on my particular marriage and circumstances. But those choices were shaped by broader social expectations, Patricia pointed out. The fact that so many found it easy to believe Nathan was the financial genius rather than you, that's not just about your individual choices. She was right, of course. I had enabled Nathan's narrative, but I hadn't created the conditions that made that narrative so readily acceptable to others. So what now? I asked. Am I supposed to become some kind of advocate? That's not a role I ever envisioned for myself. Patricia shrugged. You don't have to be anything you don't want to be. But your story has resonated for a reason. It might be worth considering why. As she left, I turned back to the article, reading the concluding paragraphs. Audrey Reynolds has declined most interview requests since establishing her own investment firm, focusing instead on building Reynolds capital management and developing her client relationships. But her emergence from behind the scenes of her husband's career has already had a significant impact on how the financial industry examines its own gender assumptions. The question many of us are asking now, says Chen, is how many other Audrey Reynolds are out there, Brilliant financial minds whose work is being attributed to others simply because it fits our preconceptions about who looks like a financial genius. I closed the tablet and turned to look out the window at the city skyline, considering Patricia's words and the unexpected trajectory my life had taken. 3 weeks ago, I had been furious about Claudia Bennett's outrageous demands on assets she hadn't earned. Now those demands had set in motion changes I could never have anticipated, not just in my own life, but potentially in the broader financial community. The irony wasn't lost on me. In trying to claim half of what she believed was Nathan's financial empire, Claudia had inadvertently revealed that the empire had never been his at all, and in doing so, she had liberated me to claim not just my assets, but my achievements, my expertise, and my rightful professional identity. As the saying goes, sometimes your worst day can lead to your best future. In my case, the day I received that legal demand letter had indeed been the beginning of an unexpected new chapter, one where I was finally the acknowledged author of my own story. The Princeton Group is growing impatient for your answer, Patricia reminded me as we sat in my office, reviewing the latest version of their offer. The compensation package is extraordinary, even by industry standards. I nodded, studying the proposal that would put me at the helm of their private client division. The terms are generous, I acknowledged, but something about it doesn't feel right. It had been 2 months since the dramatic unraveling of my marriage and the public revelation of my financial expertise. In that time, Reynolds Capital Management had grown from a personal family office to a boutique investment firm with a small but prestigious client list. My approach to wealth management, methodical, research-driven, with a strong emphasis on risk assessment, had attracted significant attention, particularly from women who controlled substantial assets. "Is it the corporate structure?" Patricia asked, trying to understand my hesitation. "Because we could negotiate more autonomy for your division." I shook my head. "It's not that. Princeton is an excellent firm with a stellar reputation." I paused, trying to articulate the discomfort I felt. I think I'm wary of having my achievements subsumed into another institution's brand, even one as respected as Princeton." Patricia studied me thoughtfully. "After 20 years of having your work attributed to Nathan, that makes perfect sense. It's not just that," I continued, the realization forming as I spoke. "It's also about what I'm building now. Reynolds Capital Management is still small, but it's mine. The investment approach, the client relationships, the company culture, I'm defining all of that. At Princeton, no matter how much autonomy they promise, I'd ultimately be fitting into their established framework." "So you're declining the offer," Patricia clarified. "I am," I confirmed, feeling a sense of clarity settle over me. "Please convey my appreciation for their interest, but explain that I'm committed to developing my own firm at this time." As Patricia made notes, my assistant buzzed the intercom. "Mrs. Reynolds, Victoria Chen is here for your lunch appointment." "Send her in," I replied, standing to greet the Stanford professor who had become a regular presence in my professional life over the past months. Victoria entered with her customary energy, a leather portfolio tucked under her arm. "Audrey, wonderful to see you. Patricia, a pleasure as always." After brief pleasantries, Patricia excused herself to make the call to Princeton, leaving Victoria and me to our scheduled lunch meeting. "I brought the final draft of the case study," Victoria said, removing a bound document from her portfolio as we settled at the small conference table where lunch had been arranged. "I'd appreciate your review before we publish." I accepted the document, glancing at the title page. "The Reynolds Method, Contrarian Indicators and Behavioral Economics in Portfolio Management." I'm still not entirely comfortable being the focus of an academic case study, I admitted. "It feels presumptuous somehow," Victoria smiled. Says the woman whose investment approach has outperformed the S&P 500 by an average of 4.2% annually for over a decade. Your discomfort with recognition is exactly why this case study is important, Audrey. Too many brilliant women minimize their achievements. She had a point, though it didn't make the attention any less uncomfortable. For years, I'd operated comfortably behind the scenes, focused on results rather than recognition. The transition to public figure in the financial world remained challenging. Speaking of recognition, Victoria continued, I have a proposal to discuss with you, one that goes beyond the guest lecture we've already scheduled. I'm listening, I said, curious about her serious tone. Stanford Business School is establishing a new center for women in finance, focused on research, education, and advancement of women in financial leadership roles. She leaned forward, her expression intent. We'd like you to serve as the inaugural executive in residence. The proposal caught me completely off guard. Me? I have no academic background, Victoria. Surely there are more qualified candidates. This isn't primarily an academic position, she explained. We're looking for someone with exceptional practical experience who can bridge the gap between theory and application. Someone who can mentor students, collaborate on research, and bring real-world insights to our programs. What would the commitment involve? I asked, intrigued despite my initial hesitation. 1 semester per year in residence at Stanford, teaching a seminar and advising selected students. Participation in quarterly symposiums and occasional special events. The rest of your time would remain your own to manage your firm. It was a compelling opportunity, one that would allow me to share my expertise while still developing Reynolds capital management. The idea of mentoring young financial professionals, particularly women entering the field, held a genuine appeal. I'd need to structure Reynolds capital management to function during my absences, I mused, already considering the logistics. Victoria smiled, sensing my interest. So you'll consider it? I will, I agreed. Send me the formal proposal, and I'll review it with my team. As our lunch concluded and Victoria departed, I found myself genuinely excited about the possibility. Teaching had never been part of my professional vision, but neither had running my own investment firm or becoming a case study in a business school curriculum. Life had taken unexpected turns since Claudia Bennett's demand letter had arrived on my doorstep. My phone buzzed with a text from Elise. Have you seen the news about Claudia and Marcus? Just hit the wire services. I quickly pulled up a financial news site where the headline immediately caught my attention. Bennett Winters fraud case expands, 7 additional victims identified across 3 states. The article detailed how the investigation into Claudia and Marcus's operation had uncovered a pattern of targeting financially successful individuals, primarily men in the financial sector who were in unhappy marriages. Their scheme had been remarkably consistent. Claudia would establish a romantic relationship while Marcus operated behind the scenes, gathering financial information and developing strategies to extract assets. What made their approach particularly insidious was how they exploited their targets' insecurities and desires for validation. In each case, they had identified men who craved admiration for their financial acumen or business success. Men like Nathan, who were susceptible to flattery and willing to make grandiose claims about their achievements to impress an attractive, seemingly adoring woman. The article included quotes from prosecutors describing the case as a sophisticated confidence scheme targeting vulnerable individuals through emotional manipulation. Reading between the lines, it appeared that many of the victims were reluctant to come forward due to embarrassment about how thoroughly they had been deceived. I felt a complex mix of emotions: satisfaction that Claudia and Marcus would face, consequences for their actions, empathy for the other victims who had been manipulated, and a lingering sadness about how Nathan's insecurities had made him such a perfect target. As I was finishing the article, Patricia returned from her call with Princeton. They're disappointed but understanding, she reported. They've left the door open for future discussions should you change your mind. Thank you for handling that, I said. And what do you think about Victoria's proposal? The Stanford position? Patricia considered for a moment. I think it aligns perfectly with what you've been building. Reynolds Capital Management is establishing a strong reputation for both performance and integrity. Adding an academic affiliation with Stanford would enhance that reputation while giving you a platform to influence the next generation of financial leaders. She was right. The opportunity represented a chance to transform my personal journey into something more meaningful, to help ensure that other talented women in finance wouldn't spend decades in the shadows as I had done. I think I'll accept, I decided. We'll need to restructure some aspects of the firm, perhaps bring in another senior manager to handle operations during my teaching periods. I might have some suggestions for that, Patricia offered. There's a promising woman at Blackstone who's looking for a more independent role. Harvard MBA, exceptional track record, values that align with your approach. Set up a meeting, I agreed. And let's review the firm's structure to ensure it can function smoothly with my divided attention. As Patricia left to make the arrangements, I found myself reflecting on how dramatically my professional identity had evolved in just a few months. From the hidden architect of the Reynolds portfolio to the public face of Reynolds Capital Management and potentially a Stanford Business School executive in residence, it was a transformation I could never have anticipated. My assistant buzzed the intercom again. "Mrs. Reynolds, there's a Mr. James Harrington on line 1. He says it's a personal matter." James Harrington, the name immediately transported me back to that dinner early in my marriage with Nathan, the evening when he had first taken credit for my investment analysis, and I had remained silent. James had been one of the clients at that table, impressed by Nathan's apparent financial insight. "Put him through," I said, curious about this blast from the past. "Audrey." James's voice was warm with recognition. "I hope you don't mind me reaching out directly." "Not at all, James. It's been quite some time." "Indeed it has," he agreed. "I've been following the news about you with great interest. The Reynolds method being your creation all along, I have to say it makes perfect sense in retrospect." "Oh?" I asked, wondering where this conversation was heading. "Absolutely. I remember that dinner at Le Bernardin must have been 18 years ago now. Nathan was explaining an investment theory that seemed remarkably sophisticated, but it was your quiet clarification that made all the difference." He chuckled. "I always wondered why my attempts to implement what I thought was Nathan's approach never quite worked. Turns out I was missing the actual architect." The fact that he remembered that specific instance and had noticed my contribution despite Nathan taking center stage was surprising. "What can I do for you, James?" I asked, genuinely curious about the purpose of his call. "Well, I've recently established a family foundation focused on financial literacy for underserved communities, particularly women and minorities," he explained. "We're assembling an advisory board of financial experts who can help shape our educational programs and investment strategy. Given your unique perspective and expertise, I thought you might be interested in getting involved." The request resonated with the direction my life had been taking. "That sounds like important work," I acknowledged. "I'd be happy to learn more about it." "Wonderful!" James sounded genuinely pleased. "My assistant will send over the foundation materials and some potential meeting dates. And Audrey? It's good to finally acknowledge your brilliance directly rather than through Nathan's lens. Long overdue, I'd say." After ending the call, I sat quietly for a moment, absorbing the significance of the conversation. James Harrington had witnessed the exact moment when the pattern of Nathan taking credit for my financial insights had begun. Now, almost 2 decades later, he was reaching out to engage directly with my expertise, a fitting closure to that chapter of my life. My phone buzzed with another text, this time from Nathan. "Just got word about the Stanford position from Victoria. Congratulations! You'll be an exceptional teacher." I was momentarily surprised that Victoria had already contacted him, but then remembered that they moved in the same professional circles despite the dissolution of our marriage. "Thank you," I replied simply. "I haven't officially accepted yet, but I'm strongly considering it." "You should," came his response. "The financial world needs more voices like yours, especially the next generation of analysts and managers." There was no bitterness in his message, no resentment about my success flourishing as we separated. Whatever his flaws, Nathan seemed genuinely committed to his own redemption story, acknowledging my contributions and supporting my emergence into the spotlight he had once occupied. As the afternoon sun cast golden light across my office, I found myself in a moment of peaceful reflection. The crisis that had begun with Claudia Bennett's audacious demands had transformed my life in ways I could never have imagined. What had initially seemed like a devastating betrayal had ultimately liberated me from patterns and compromises I hadn't even fully recognized. The woman who had received that legal letter demanding half of our assets would hardly recognize the person I was becoming, someone stepping confidently into her expertise, claiming her achievements publicly, and preparing to share her knowledge with others who might otherwise remain in the shadows. In a strange way, I owed a debt of gratitude to Claudia Bennett. Her attempt to claim what was never hers to take had set in motion a chain of events that allowed me to finally claim what had always been mine. Not just the assets I had protected, but the recognition, the authority, and the professional identity I had earned through years of brilliant work. Sometimes, I reflected, our greatest opportunities emerge from our most difficult challenges. And sometimes, those who intend us harm inadvertently set us on the path to our most authentic selves. The auditorium at Stanford Business School was filled to capacity, with students and faculty crowding the aisles and lining the back wall. As I prepared to deliver the keynote address for the inaugural symposium of the Center for Women in Finance, I couldn't help but reflect on the remarkable journey that had brought me to this moment. Exactly 1 year had passed since Claudia Bennett's demand letter had arrived at my doorstep, shattering the careful facade of my marriage and inadvertently setting me on a path to reclaim my true identity. In those 12 months, I had transformed from the hidden architect of the Reynolds portfolio to a recognized authority in investment strategy, the founder of a thriving wealth management firm, and now the executive in residence at one of the nation's top business schools. From my position backstage, I could see Victoria Chen introducing me to the audience, highlighting the investment methodology I had developed and its consistent outperformance of market benchmarks. The large screen behind her displayed a simple slide with my name and the title of my address: Hidden Figures, Uncovering Women's Contributions to Financial Innovation. "Without further ado," Victoria concluded, "please join me in welcoming Audrey Reynolds." The applause that greeted me as I stepped onto the stage was warm and enthusiastic. I adjusted the microphone and surveyed the diverse audience before me. Young women and men preparing to enter the financial world, established professionals seeking new insights, faculty members curious about my practical approach to investment theory. "Thank you for that generous introduction, Victoria," I began, "and thank you all for being here today. When I was invited to deliver this keynote, I spent a great deal of time considering what wisdom I could possibly impart that isn't already covered in your excellent curriculum." A gentle laugh rippled through the audience. What I realized is that my greatest value might lie not in technical expertise about market indicators or valuation models, though we'll certainly touch on those, but in sharing the journey that brought me here. Because until very recently, I was what we might call a hidden figure in finance, someone whose work was influential but whose name remained unknown. I paused, taking a sip of water and gathering my thoughts. For 20 years, I developed investment strategies, managed a complex portfolio, and built significant wealth, all while allowing my then-husband to be the public face of that success. The financial world knew him as the architect of the Reynolds method, while I remained in the background, the supportive spouse at charity galas and client dinners. The audience was rapt, many of the women nodding in recognition of this familiar dynamic. I didn't begin my career intending to hide my light. Like many of you, I graduated with stellar credentials: Wharton undergraduate, Goldman Sachs analyst track, and high ambitions. But somewhere along the way, I made compromises that seemed small at the time but grew more significant with each passing year. For the next 40 minutes, I shared the evolution of my career, from my early days developing innovative investment approaches to the gradual erosion of my public professional identity, as Nathan became the face of our financial success. I spoke candidly about the complex motivations behind my choices, the desire to preserve marital harmony, the unexpected advantages of being underestimated, the gradual adaptation to a role that became increasingly comfortable even as it constrained me. The turning point came in the most unexpected way, I continued, careful to present a version of events that respected the confidentiality agreements surrounding the Claudia Bennett case. A personal crisis forced me to document and demonstrate my financial contributions in a way I had never needed to before. Suddenly, the careful structures I had built to protect our assets became the evidence of my true role in creating them. I described the subsequent months, establishing Reynolds capital management, reclaiming public credit for my investment approach, adapting to the spotlight after decades in the shadows. But this isn't just my story, I emphasized, moving to the core message of my address. Research suggests that women's contributions in finance are systematically underrecognized and undervalued. A recent study found that female fund managers often outperform their male counterparts, yet manage only a fraction of total assets. Female CFOs deliver superior financial performance, yet remain significantly underrepresented in executive suites. I clicked on a slide showing data from Victoria's groundbreaking research on gender attribution bias in financial achievements. Professor Chen's work demonstrates that financial innovations developed by women are 60% more likely to be attributed to male colleagues or supervisors than similar innovations developed by men. The phenomenon has become known as the Reynolds effect, though I must note the irony of having my name attached to a bias that kept my work anonymous for so long. This drew appreciative laughter from the audience. The question we must ask ourselves is not just how to identify and correct these attribution errors, but how to create environments where women's financial brilliance is recognized from the outset, where brilliant analysts and strategists don't become hidden figures in the first place. For the remainder of my address, I outlined concrete strategies for institutional change, mentorship approaches, and individual practices that could help ensure talented women in finance received appropriate recognition for their work. I concluded with a call to action directed primarily at the students in the audience. Your generation has an unprecedented opportunity to transform the financial landscape, I told them. You enter the field at a time when old assumptions are being questioned, when diverse perspectives are increasingly valued, when the very definition of financial leadership is evolving. I looked out at the young faces watching me intently, seeing in them the passion and determination I had once felt at the beginning of my own career. My journey from hidden architect to visible leader was unnecessarily long and circuitous. My hope for each of you is a straighter path, one where your contributions are recognized from the start, where your brilliance shines without diminishment, where you never need to choose between harmony and acknowledgement. The standing ovation that followed my concluding remarks was both gratifying and slightly overwhelming. As Victoria rejoined me on stage for the planned Q&A session, I felt a sense of purpose that transcended my individual success. My personal story had become something larger, a catalyst for conversations about recognition, attribution, and equality in the financial world. The questions from the audience were thoughtful and probing, ranging from technical inquiries about my investment methodology to personal questions about managing the transition from anonymity to visibility. A young woman in the front row asked about balancing ambition with relationships, her expression suggesting this was a deeply personal concern. I won't pretend there's an easy formula, I answered honestly. But I will say this. True partnership, whether professional or personal, should amplify your brilliance, not diminish it. Anyone who asks you to make yourself smaller to accommodate their ego isn't a partner worth having. As the session concluded and Victoria escorted me from the stage, my assistant approached with an update on the day's schedule. "The dean's reception begins in 30 minutes, she reminded me. "And Patricia called. The closing documents for the Harrington Foundation investment are ready for your signature." Over the past year, James Harrington's foundation had become Reynolds Capital Management's most significant client. What had begun as an advisory board position had evolved into a comprehensive partnership, with my firm managing the foundation's endowment using a specialized impact investing approach I had developed specifically for their mission of financial empowerment. "Mrs. Reynolds?" A hesitant voice interrupted my thoughts. I turned to find a student waiting nearby, clutching a copy of the Financial Times with my recent profile on the cover. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, "but your story has meant so much to me. I've been hiding my financial models because my study group always attributes them to the male members. After reading about you, I started putting my name prominently on everything I create." The simple action seemed small, but I recognized its significance. "That's exactly where it begins," I told her, signing the magazine she offered, "with claiming authorship of your own work." The afternoon continued with a reception hosted by the business school dean, followed by meetings with faculty members interested in incorporating case studies of Reynolds Capital Management into their curriculum. By early evening, I was back in my Stanford apartment, reviewing quarterly performance reports from my firm's management team. My phone rang, Elise calling for our weekly check-in. "How was the big speech?" she asked when I answered. "Surprisingly emotional," I admitted. Talking about the journey of the past year in that context, it hit differently than I expected. "From hidden wife to financial rock star in 12 months, Elise teased. "Have I mentioned lately how proud I am of you?" "Only every time we talk," I laughed. "But how are things with you? How's the gallery expansion going?" Elise launched into updates about her thriving art business, the new space she was opening in Chicago, and her ongoing search for emerging artists. As she spoke, I found myself marveling at how our relationship had evolved over the past year. Where once our conversations had been dominated by my marital problems and career constraints, now we spoke as equals. Two successful women pursuing their respective passions. "Oh, before I forget," Elise said, her tone shifting slightly, "I ran into Nathan last week at the Phillips auction." My interest piqued. "How is he?" "Good, actually. Different than before. More authentic somehow. He's focusing on the consulting firm's client relationships rather than trying to position himself as a financial guru. It seems to be working for him." I wasn't surprised. Nathan's strengths had always been in relationship building and communication rather than financial strategy. Without the pressure to maintain the fiction of being an investment genius, he was free to excel in areas where he had genuine talent. "He asked about you," Elise continued. "Wanted to know if you were happy in your new life. I told him you were thriving." "That's accurate," I confirmed, "and I'm glad he's finding his way too." After ending the call with Elise, I stepped onto the small balcony of my apartment, looking out at the Stanford campus illuminated by the setting sun. Tomorrow would bring more meetings, another seminar with promising students, continued work on refining Reynolds Capital Management's investment approach. The rhythm of my days now was so different from the life I had lived a year ago, more demanding, in many ways, but also more fulfilling. Where once I had channeled my financial brilliance through the filter of Nathan's public persona, now I expressed it directly through my firm, my teaching, and my growing influence on the financial community. My phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. "Outstanding keynote today." The students are still buzzing about it. Planning committee wants to make it an annual address, the Reynolds Lecture on Women in Finance. Thoughts? The idea of establishing a permanent platform for discussing women's contributions to financial innovation was appealing. I'm honored. Let's discuss the details tomorrow, I replied. As I prepared for bed that night, I found myself thinking about Claudia Bennett, whose audacious demands had inadvertently changed the course of my life. According to media reports, she and Marcus had recently accepted a plea deal in their fraud case, avoiding a public trial, but facing significant consequences for their actions. There was a certain symmetry to how things had unfolded. Claudia had targeted Nathan because she believed he controlled substantial wealth. Her demand for half of everything had forced me to reveal that the assets had never been his to give away. And that revelation had ultimately freed me to claim not just my financial assets, but my professional identity and accomplishments. In seeking to take what wasn't hers, Claudia had inadvertently pushed me to fully claim what had always been mine. The mine. Next morning, it dawned bright and clear. I dressed carefully for my seminar on contrarian investment indicators, choosing a sophisticated blue suit that projected confidence and authority. As I gathered my materials, I noticed the framed article on my desk, the first major profile that had identified me as the true architect of the Reynolds investment method. The headline still made me smile. The Woman Behind the Curtain: How Audrey Reynolds quietly built a financial empire while her husband took the credit. It had been a painful revelation at the time, but now it served as a reminder of how far I had come, and how determined I was to ensure other talented women wouldn't need to follow such a circuitous path to recognition. My seminar that morning was particularly energetic, with students engaging deeply in the case study I had prepared on identifying market inefficiencies. As I guided them through my analytical approach, I found myself thinking about how different this was from the years I had spent explaining my investment strategies to Nathan so he could present them as his own in client meetings. The key, I told the students, isn't just identifying the contrarian indicator, but having the confidence to act on it when conventional wisdom points in the opposite direction. It requires both analytical rigor and psychological resilience. One young woman raised her hand. Mrs. Reynolds, how do you maintain that confidence when senior colleagues dismiss your analysis? The question resonated with experiences from my own career. Document everything, I advised. Build a record of your analytical process and outcomes. Over time, results speak louder than hierarchy. And when possible, align yourself with mentors who recognize and amplify your contributions rather than diminishing them. After class, I met with Patricia over lunch to review the latest developments with Reynolds Capital Management. The firm had grown substantially over the past year, with assets under management now exceeding $2 billion and a team of 15 investment professionals implementing my strategies. The Stanford affiliation has been extraordinarily beneficial. For our brand positioning, Patricia noted, we've seen a 40% increase in inquiries from high-net-worth women seeking wealth management services. And how's the new research team performing? I asked, referring to the group of analysts I had recently hired to further develop and test my investment approaches. Exceptional work so far, Patricia confirmed. The enhancement to your behavioral economics model is showing promising results. In backtesting, we should be ready to implement it across client portfolios next quarter. As our lunch concluded, Patricia handed me an envelope. The final divorce decree arrived yesterday, officially filed and recorded. Though Nathan and I had reached our settlement terms a year ago, various legal complications and the ongoing fraud case against Claudia and Marcus had delayed the formal completion of our divorce. This final document represented the official conclusion of a 20-year chapter of my life. Thank you, I said, accepting the envelope without opening it. The contents held no surprises, just the legal confirmation of a personal reality I had already processed and moved beyond. Patricia studied me carefully. How does it feel to have it officially completed? I considered the question. Like a formality, honestly. The real ending happened a year ago when I stepped out of the shadows and into my own light. She nodded, understanding. And what a year it's been. Indeed it had. From the morning I had received Claudia Bennett's outrageous demand letter to this moment, recognized financial expert, successful firm founder, respected educator, the transformation had been extraordinary. Not just in my external circumstances, but in my fundamental sense of self. That evening, I was scheduled to address a private gathering of women in finance, a networking event organized by Victoria to connect students with established professionals. As I entered the venue, I was struck by the energy in the room. Dozens of brilliant women at various stages of their careers, engaged in animated conversations about market trends, investment strategies, and institutional challenges. Audrey. Victoria waved me over to a group that included several faculty members and a woman I didn't recognize. I'd like you to meet Michelle Terrence, the new CFO at Goldman Sachs. Michelle shook my hand warmly. The famous Audrey Reynolds. Your keynote today was extraordinary, particularly the parts about attribution bias in financial achievements. Thank you, I replied. It's an issue I've become rather passionate about, for obvious reasons. We're actually implementing new policies at Goldman, partially inspired by your experience, Michelle revealed. Creating systems to ensure that innovative ideas are properly credited to their originators, regardless of gender or position in the hierarchy. It was gratifying to hear that my story was inspiring concrete institutional changes. Throughout the evening, I had similar conversations with women from various financial institutions, investment banks, hedge funds, venture capital firms, all of them working in their own ways to address the biases and barriers I had discussed in my keynote. As the event wound down, Victoria joined me at a quiet table in the corner. You've started something important here, Audrey. Something that goes well beyond your individual success. I nodded, acknowledging the truth in her assessment. It's strange to think that none of this would have happened if Claudia Bennett hadn't sent that demand letter a year ago. One woman's attempt to take what wasn't hers led to another woman finally claiming what had always been hers, Victoria smiled. The universe works in mysterious ways. Indeed it does, I agreed, thinking of the extraordinary journey of the past year. Indeed it does. Later that night, as I sat alone in my apartment reviewing notes for the next day's meetings, I received an unexpected email from Nathan. The subject line read simply, "Congratulations. Audrey, I saw the announcement about the Reynolds Lecture being established as an annual event at Stanford. It's a fitting recognition of your impact on the field and on the next generation of financial leaders. I've been reflecting lately on our years together, the good and the bad. While I regret many things, particularly how I diminished your contributions, I find myself grateful for how things have unfolded. You're finally being recognized for your brilliance, and I'm learning to build an identity based on truth rather than fiction. In case you're wondering, the consulting firm is doing well with its refocused approach. It turns out I'm actually quite good at client relationships and communication when I'm not pretending to be a financial genius. There's a certain freedom in authenticity, as I imagine you've discovered too. I wish you continued success in all your endeavors." Nathan and I sat with the email for a moment, appreciating its sincerity. Despite everything that had happened, I didn't harbor bitterness toward Nathan. He had been trapped in his own way by the fiction we had constructed together, the successful financial wizard and his supportive wife. Now we were both free to become more authentic versions of ourselves. "Thank you, Nathan," I wrote back. "I'm glad to hear you're finding your own path forward. Wishing you the best as well." Simple, honest, closure. As I prepared for bed, I thought about the remarkable journey that had brought me to this point. The demand letter that had felt like a catastrophe had actually been the catalyst for profound positive change. The mistress who had tried to claim half of what she thought was Nathan's fortune had inadvertently freed me to claim all of what had always been mine. Not just the financial assets I had carefully protected, but the recognition, respect, and influence I had earned through years of brilliant work. The woman who had received that letter a year ago would hardly recognize the person I had become. Confident in my expertise, comfortable in the spotlight, committed to ensuring other talented women received the recognition they deserved. Sometimes I reflected as I drifted toward sleep, our greatest opportunities emerged from our most painful challenges. And sometimes, those who intend to diminish us inadvertently set us on the path to becoming more fully ourselves than we ever imagined possible. I had emerged from the shadows of Nathan's career into the full light of my own, not just reclaiming my financial assets, but discovering a voice, a purpose, and a path forward that I never could have anticipated when this journey began. The mistress had demanded half of everything, never realizing that in doing so, she would ultimately help me claim it all. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.